dust landing on it. And so because of that, I'm used to working in environments with very clean air and having tools like this that can measure particles, for example, before a filter and after, so you could actually quantify, all right, how good of a job does this do-it-yourself air purifier do in removing particles of different sizes from the air, so we can measure that. And then you also want to know how much air is getting moved through the filter, because you know, if you have like a tiny little fan and filter, that's not going to be able to serve a big room, right? And so you need to be able to quantify that and figure out for a room, you know, with a certain volume, how much air is actually getting cleaned, and is it actually going to make a difference or not? And so that was, I think, what I was able to add to the effort, is to do those measurements, take the data, analyze it, and say, okay, yeah, if you look at the particle filtration efficiency and the airflow rate that you get with this type of setup, it actually is comparable to what you would get with a commercial purifier, but at a fraction of the cost.
We've obviously got one version of it up here. We're gonna, I think, be able to build some other ones here in just a little bit. But Hugh, in terms of their effectiveness, I mean, what were you able to see in your testing in your lab?
So in terms of removing particles, a single pass through the filter, depending on the particle size, could take out 70 to 80% of those particles. And so, you know, one concern that somebody might have is, okay, well, here's this fan. Is it just going to be blowing, you know, infectious particles all over the room? But if the filter is able to remove that large of a fraction of any type of particles, but also infectious viral particles, actually the air coming out of the fan is the cleanest in the room. And so Doug is sitting in a great spot.
Yes.
You can see he's got the clean air blowing right near him. And in terms of, but I should say that that efficiency is a little bit lower than what you would get with a so-called HEPA filter. That's, you know, what you would find in hospitals or clean rooms or things like that. However, the flow is better. So a $20 box fan from Walmart can pull more air through one of those filters than the fans that you typically will find with HEPA filters. And so it's actually the combination of the efficiency and the flow that you care about in terms of delivering clean air into the room. And so that higher flow more than compensates for the slightly lower filtration efficiency. And so it's really just as good.
That's awesome. And then Sarah, I don't know, I'd love to hear your thoughts on, so there's the data and the verification aspect, right? If this solution works, here's kind of a stamp of credibility that goes along with the solution. And I think the other piece is tying in the educational aspects, right?
Mm-hmm. So when he's talking, the words that stick out to me as a 7th grade math teacher are volume, because those are my standards. And the data collection, like those are our standards too. Like we're going to do that anyway. And so this is going to give us the perfect opportunity to collect real-time data with our own system. We can find the volume of our classroom. Do we need more than one of these? What about the band room or the choir room? Do they need multiple? And so there's lots of problem solving opportunities for us that fit perfectly into 7th grade math.
So what really stood out to me, right, is you almost have an educational tool, right, that you can provide very cost effectively to the classroom. Oh, and by the way, it just happens to have a major impact on your COVID, right, which is relevant to the time that you build it. And you made a really interesting comment around, you know, comparing it to a traditional HEPA filter, right, or a commercial unit. I know one of the first things when we went to visit Sarah in her classroom, you know, we learned about some of the limitations that classroom or school has on implementing stuff, right, any new infrastructure. And one story in particular stood out to me around the extension cable, but I'd love you to talk about the environment.
Yeah, absolutely. So one thing also, like my classroom budget is $0. So this is much better than whatever the HEPA filter. But like we cannot have extension cords, and so that's something you don't think about when you're like, they were like, oh, works best is in the center of the room. And I was like, well, it cannot go there. And so we have it, and then it was like, oh, it works best if it's lifted. So we were able to they had done all the research to say this is the best situation, and we were able to lift it and put it a little bit out in the room But since we can't have those extension cords or something like that, but it's still, I mean, it's still great for that space.
Well, no, and I think it's very common in entrepreneurship, right? What works perfectly in the lab, right, doesn't always survive the real world, right? And so this was a very stark example of that, where real world limitations get in the way of a perfect solution, right? And Hugh, I know there was some conversations around UL certification, and does it mean, I think in this space, I think you had a lot of fun with infrastructure upgrades. Everything has to meet a specific standard. But Hugh, I think in this particular case, you were able to track down some data, right?
Yeah, so we kind of approached it from a few different angles. One angle is to say, well, okay, let's take the combination of the fan and the filter and the duct tape and try to get it certified. And so actually, because this idea has been around for more than a year, the person who has really pushed it is somebody named Jim Rosenthal at this company, CleanARAir filters in Texas. He actually got an analysis done by a lab associated with Underwriters Laboratory that does those UL certifications to say, there's not going to be a fire that started because the fan's working harder or something like that. And in fact, the plugs all have protection in them anyway if something were to happen. And so that's one angle. The other angle is actually provided by this. Pick it up and show it. This particular box fan filter is a little bit of a different one. So this is an actual commercial product made by Lasco. So they made it so that there's a little slot in the back where the filter can go in, and then so this is an official, legitimate, actually certified product, and it's pretty good. So you can see that I did go ahead and modify this one, right? I put the cardboard on the front, and that's because unfortunately Lasco did not either didn't realize or decided it wasn't worth it to put this so-called shroud. So what happens when you have a square fan and a round fan blade is that the corners of the fan are places where unfiltered air can actually get sucked in. And so if you measure the airflow from the fan, it actually goes this way on the corners and blows out in the middle. And so basically the approach that I take is to give options to people who might want to use them. If it's a really strict UL only situation, then you take that product, you don't put the cardboard on it, and then you're totally good. But if you have some flexibility, then there are upgrades and things that you can do to make the performance even better.
It's awesome. So kind of the hardware, right, is in place, right? There's a very defined problem. How do you go? What is the product in your case, I guess, right? Because there's a couple of different ways to think about it.
That's a good question. In some sense, the product is just the messaging, right? That here's a good idea. I'm a physicist who's measured the performance and will say that it actually could make a difference and satisfy what the CDC said is a good thing to do. In another sense, the product is trying to make connections between teachers who would like to deploy these in their classrooms and people who either have the time or the money to donate them. So we're trying to be facilitators between donors and teachers or school districts to try to have an impact. And I think the product is probably not the actual thing because this is something that a lot of people have contacted me and said, why are you taking credit for this? It's not something that that you came up with, and that's something that I've tried hard to push back on. That it's definitely not. I'm not claiming it as my invention or our invention, but instead is something we tested and that we're promoting and trying to get the word out.
And so there's a whole educational resource. So I might be pointing at it for some of you, CleanARair.com, right, where there's all the data that he was able to collect, right? There's instructions for how to build it, right? And you don't have to buy anything, right? You just click through, get the stuff. But one of the interesting things, right, is Sarah, you mentioned your classroom budget is 0, right? And so there's kind of this interesting dynamic, I think, with social enterprises, right? Where if there's no markup on the product, right? The product is effectively at cost. How do you pay to raise awareness for it, right? Or how do you get the message out there? And you know, I think there's probably some optimization curve for you to do at some point, maybe, right? Like, hey, if you made a little bit on each one, right, and then you could get it out to more people, what is your overall impact? Right? What is the metric for measuring your impact? And so, you know, I think one of the challenges that's probably been involved in this project, right, is just around how do you raise awareness for something like this? And I'd love to hear your thoughts on that.
Yeah, I mean, so it's something that really has built up over time, and I would say much more rapidly than I would have expected back in, I guess that was in July when we had that first discussion about it. Right, so it started with, you know, me making the pitch for 5 minutes or something on this call, and then the next kind of level up was to follow up with an email, you know, to Doug and others, and that was basically like a paragraph of me hitting the various points about why this is a good idea, and you know, with references for, you know, backing up the claims, and then from there, it really got into the okay, let's actually test it out and see what it could do. And Doug had the foresight that really, you know, making a video explaining what's going on here could be very impactful. So that started out with, you know, Doug had a video camera at home that he lent to me, and you know, we filmed me saying some things about it, and filmed my 9-year-old making one in his grandparents' backyard. You know, he said some words, right? And that was kind of a relatively low budget, you know, kind of homemade version. And then we used basically that effort and the beginnings of this website, CleanARAir.com, to try to get university relations involved and interested and excited about what we were doing. And so we felt like we had sort of enough ammunition to present to them that they might bite. You know, I reached out, and you know, they picked it up, and then we were able to make a higher quality video and got the news article in UA News out about it. And then local media picked it up. That resulted in various opportunities, both, you know, on TV and radio, to try to spread the word. So it really was a you know, kind of step-by-step thing of trying to build it up, but that escalated pretty rapidly over a period of a month or so.
And Sarah, I know you've done some work around raising awareness for it. So kind of on something like this, right? It's like, well, what's the product, right? Who is the customer, right? And I think you can define those in a lot of different ways. And one of them, though, is just getting the teachers excited about it, right? And so can you talk a little bit about that process?
Yeah, absolutely. So whenever Doug was like, would anyone be interested in this? I was like, I definitely would. And every person I asked that is also a teacher was like, yes, how can I get one of these? And those are, you know, just my close contacts. And then I actually sent one to like the whole school, and like, you know, here's the website, here's how we do this, and even got more feedback from everyone. And we were just talking about, then they go like, let's make a professional development where teachers can come and we build these, and then, you know, let's write a lesson plan for your content. And so it's, you know, we're the customer, but we're also going to be able to use this in our classroom.
Yeah, and then the ultimate goal, I think, right, is, and there's so many different ways to deliver them to the classroom, right, and get them paid for it, right? You know, one of them is obviously asking the teachers to pay, which is a tough thing to do, right? One of them is asking philanthropic support. And it's interesting, right? There's a donate button on the website. You and I don't know about you, but I was pretty surprised when the first donation just came through out of the blue. But yeah, the community, right? Parents, all of that, how do you reach them and get them engaged? Because in this case, it's proven that they want to support this sort of thing. But you know, how do you scale that? And you know, Hugh, I'm a bit nervous for you the day when you get a $10,000 donation, right? And your entire week is going to be putting together, you know, box fans and filters, and driving them all over, right? But you know, so how do you handle success when and if your venture takes off, right? And thinking through the logistics, thinking through the unit cost on it, right? And Hugh, I know you've had a lot of different suppliers provide filters to you, for instance. right? And can you talk us about the evaluation of those and which ones you're comfortable recommending? Like, what's that process like?
Sure. So, I would have thought, if you go to Amazon or Walmart and search for the right type of filter. So one thing that we haven't mentioned is that, the cheapest filters that you can buy don't actually do a good job. If you want to get the 70 to 80% that we're talking about, you need to get like the $15 filters, so-called MERV 12 or 13 filters. And I would have thought, there's good enough industry, quality control or whatever that any MERV 13 filter that you order is going to do just as good a job, because it has that certification or whatever. But actually, the most popular brand that shows up on Amazon, if you search for these things, FilterBuy, does a terrible job. It performs, like one of those $5 filters, and it's still better than nothing, but it's less than half of the filtration performance that you get from the other ones.
I bought a bunch of those early on, right? Now it's like, hey, but how do we get some of these to start testing? That's immediately what I bought, right? And if we had started deploying those, that wouldn't have had the impact that you wanted.
That's right. That's right. And so that's been, it's been sort of a challenging aspect of the, kind of the promotion or marketing is that, I very much want to say, don't buy a filter, buy a user guide filter. But of course, like the University of Arkansas is not comfortable making that statement, right? And so trying to walk that line between, making our recommendations clear, for example, on the website versus not really being able to be as explicit about that in various news articles and things like that.
And Sarah, I know we were talking a little bit beforehand about various lesson plans that you can implement, right, to not only test filter efficiency on day one, but changes over time, right? Can you talk a little bit about how this could be integrated into curriculum over an entire semester, perhaps? Or?
Yeah, so we were talking, well, one, those filters aren't effective, that's okay, because my students don't know that yet. And so we can get those and we can test them and compare.
Well, you got good filters, right?
I know, I
You
have
do.
and our filters, we had about a month, and they're starting to look a little dusty. And so they were like, we need to change these, and that's the perfect opportunity for us to let's start gathering some data. Let's use our aerator.
Anemometer.
So let's get our anemometer and let's test it. Let's start every Friday. We're going to check in and let's, how do we systematize this data collection, and can we see a change over time and make predictions about when we will need a new filter? And so just using those tools and basically a scientific method in real time with the filter.
Yeah. And I think what always stuck out to me as well was tying that scientific lesson, right, to something that I think every teacher, student, in the entire world is thinking about this thing, right? So you're making a lesson very tangible to their reality on the thing you can't really see, right? Which I always thought was really powerful. What I know we're going to take some time in a little bit for the audience to help us work through some of the challenges. We've talked about the raising awareness aspect, we talked about some of the facilities related aspects. What other challenges kind of surprised you along the way and getting to where we are?
So I think the biggest remaining challenge that we haven't mentioned is just the maybe I'll say delicate nature of working on a project related to coronavirus, right? It's like probably the most politically charged thing that there is going on right now. And so it maybe wasn't surprising. Like I was very much aware that, okay, if I'm going to go in this direction, there's going to be some interesting discussions related to that. But I think one of the challenges that I didn't expect was that lots of times people, or maybe almost always people have, kind of already settled on what they think is the right thing to be doing. Like, everybody has their different levels of caution, right? There are all kinds of different masks that people are wearing or not wearing, right? And where you are on that scale. But wherever you are, you've kind of decided that that's the right place to be. And one of the challenges, I think, is in not only trying to present the idea, but you're also needing to change somebody's mind, right? And say, look, here's an additional layer that you should add because, it adds a little bit of noise to the classroom. It's a little bit of cost, but could be effective. But you have to change their mind into thinking that an additional layer is actually a good idea and worth pursuing.
But it's interesting because I think in one of the conversations we had with one of the state's leading medical experts, right? I think one of his concerns was if this adds too much comfort to people, right, then it could kind of undermine other measures, right? Suddenly you're not wearing your mask because you got this thing next to you, right? Could it actually have a negative impact, right? So reinforcing that this is an additional layer of protection, right, instead of a replacement. So are there any other challenges from your perspective from kind of the educational environment? Or?
I think really like I'm wanting to dive right into it. Let's do a project. Let's just do this all the time. But we still have, I've got my pacing guides. And I've got a team of teachers I teach with, but if they don't all want to spend 2 weeks on this filter project, and so it's like, where do we work in that learning where it fits with my curriculum, but also like, can we branch out, do our own thing, or whether we have to still stick with our school?
Yeah. So once again, meeting the reality of a classroom environment, right? Which is not trivial. Excellent. Well, so where are we on time at the moment?
We're good on time. We have at least 10 minutes before.
So I'd love to just get the audience's thoughts, feedback on or questions for Hugh, Sarah, or myself. Yeah.
So thank you all for being here tonight. This has been so fascinating to finally hear the backstory. Have you ever thought about patenting? I know you said you didn't invent anything, but you did change the combination of parts compared with what was available out there. Have you considered that pathway?
I have not, mostly because I think of all of the things that you see in terms of modifications, I didn't think of any of them. And so, the idea about the shroud is something that there's actually a community, believe it or not, of people who are into do-it-yourself air purifiers. And so the shroud idea has been, widely disseminated within that community. The stand that you see is actually a concept jointly developed by Ford Motor Company and the University of Minnesota. They were kind enough to send us a demo to try out. And so I don't think there's anything novel and patentable there, but
Where's David?
I know.
Yeah.
I mean, the reason I ask is because if you could patent it, then potentially you could get some seed funding to scale the operation. That there are other entrepreneurs out there that had a social innovation with real impact, and they couldn't get it out into the world by giving it away. They had to commercialize it so that the market had a way of adopting it. But I don't know how you would do that without patents.
yeah, I mean, I think maybe, and I was actually going to email these like this, but maybe we could have the conversation. I think maybe one of the challenges that we had early on was we wanted to have a website where teachers could say I want one, and donors could say I want to donate one or give money. And I was looking around for a while for some kind of platform that exists that's kind of like GoFundMe, but not for money, but instead for objects. Or things that people make themselves, and potentially, I don't know, some platform that facilitates that, not just for self-care purifiers, but other things.
Yes, that's fun. So that would be a great project for a social innovation team. Throw that out there.
And you've got your first object to list.
Yeah.
Yes, talking about access, I was just curious, and Sarah, you might have some opinions, but as a mom, have you ever thought about the approach like through local PTAs or PTOs? They just typically have money that they're looking to spend on the school. I just didn't know that could be a way into the most efficient way into these schools, because like spending dollars within the school system is a lot harder, and the PTAs typically have access, and it's a lot easier to get there. And I know I have lots of school teacher family members, but also friends that had parents, like the homeroom mom, buy a commercial version for the classroom. But I think having that educational component, I think there'd be a draw there. I don't know if you explored that avenue.
Absolutely. So we talked about it at the beginning, because whenever you do like ask for donations and either monetary or otherwise, there's different channels you have to go through. So we're like, okay, well, how do we, we can't just blast it on the school social media. So we have to, our personal social media. And so we're still kind of looking at like, how can we get to a point where we are like putting it on the school social media and saying, hey, does anyone want to donate to the choir or band? Because that's the goal. But, that's probably the fastest way to get it, is when people are buying it for their own children at
school,
their
yeah.
schools.
Yeah, I just know that PTOs, they have funds that, and especially because from my experience last year in the schools, there was just a lot of events that didn't happen that they normally have funds allocated for. So they could be fund heavy right now and looking for ways to improve the school. So that could be the, avenue or resource.
We should definitely push your button.
Okay, so you talked earlier that the $15 filters do like 80% elimination, right? Or filtration. So how's the cheaper versions? How much is the difference? Is it like 20, 30, 40% filtration?
It's about half.
Okay.
So if you could do the math, right? You're spending 3 times as much on filters for twice the effectiveness. And so I think you have to decide, like there's really a continuum of possibilities, right? From the very cheapest possible intervention, which again, is better than nothing, all the way up to commercial HEPA filter. And I guess I would say that we have pretty much just landed on trying to promote, here's the best that you could do with stuff you can buy at Walmart right now. And that's kind of been our approach, but you could definitely make arguments for, well, maybe you buy 3 cheap ones for the same price as one good one. And in some situations, maybe that's absolutely.
Yeah, I was just like, the idea just popped in my head. What like that you could just use 2 filters, like you just put 2 filters and that way it filters it more. But I don't know. I don't actually know science, so like, you'd have to tell me how that works and like why would 2 cheaper filters versus one like $15 filter? What's the difference between those?
Yeah, so that's great. To be thinking about variations and options like that. So back to back doesn't work, it turns out, because of the flow requirement. So if you do 2 filters, that's going to knock the flow down. And so you actually don't win that way. But definitely, there are lots of kind of one of the most fun aspects of this project has been to try to think through all of the different permutations of how you could build this thing with different components. And I would not be at all surprised if there were some better way of going about it that we haven't thought of yet, because there are just so many options to explore.
It kind of comes down to what's the metric you're trying to optimize, I guess. Right? It's interesting, right? So Ford actually built 20,000-ish units that look very similar to this, right? And deployed them across the US. And we're going to be building cube structures here in a little bit, which are more effective in a classroom environment. But one of the reasons Ford went with this was because from a logistics and transportation perspective, you could drop them easier into a box and 14 to a pallet, drop them off at a school and you're done, right? And so what going back once again, the thing that works best in the lab, right? Once you get to distribution aspect, right, you may have to go back to the lab, right, and re-optimize, right? So I'm taking that real world consideration. Another question.
If I may, that's an excellent point. Actually, thank you for being here, and thank you, Doug, for bringing such a clear example of what a social innovation is and the path that has to go through in order to reach the market. I was asking Madison if I could use the recording to show it to the students in the Global Perspectives class, which is right here, because I think it's very valuable. And what you just said, definitely, from the lab to the reality, and then go back to the lab and redesign the whole thing to make it cost effective and all these things. But one question that I had is like, maybe it's worth that conversation about the patent, right? And, because I think that's the only path, and perhaps even thinking beyond the framework of COVID and the reality that permeates our world today, because there are many places around the world that could benefit from something like this. Very they need this kind of thing, right? Many classrooms in many places where dust is the is the constant gas in the room, and that ruins everything, from a computer lab to. So I think there's a market that goes way beyond America, where this innovation is really something that could make a difference.
Well, there's, so I come out of a world, right? Most of my time is spent on things that are very patentable, right? And the entire value of the company is effectively the intellectual property. One thing I think that's really cool about this, right, there is an opportunity for a brand, right? Maybe you could build a brand around the credibility that someone like Hugh brings to it, right? And package that somehow. But execution is absolutely critical, right? Even if you have intellectual property, you got to execute. If you don't have intellectual property, you can still win in the market if you execute better than anyone else, right? And so maybe there's an opportunity there, right, to have that sort of impact, even if the thing isn't protected by a patent. If you're within a university setting, you should definitely talk to your tech licensing office.
I guess I would follow up on your point about, the broader market and, post COVID, hopefully we look forward to that. I think one of the things that the pandemic has done scientifically is completely changed our understanding about the importance of clean air. So it started out that, everybody was worried about surfaces and wiping their groceries and stuff like that. But there were some epidemiologists and aerosol scientists and so forth who said, look, a lot of these super spreader things that we see, it can only be explained by airborne transmission and these particles that are suspended in the air for a long time. And those people, kind of screamed at the top of their lungs for a year, and finally the scientific community came around and said, okay, yeah, you're right. And it's not just coronavirus, but it's also flu, allergens. And so I think that there is a market for clean air, and I think it's really going to grow because the regulations for what the air quality in buildings has to be is based on a prior understanding of what it means to have a healthy building, and that has completely changed. I don't think that's really permeated into the non-scientific community probably, but I think just like we have lots and lots of regulations about how healthy our drinking water has to be, I think that it's going to completely change what we expect of air in our buildings. And I think that will be a big market.
Where in the country do you expect to sell units and things like that? Do you expect to sell more in big cities and then less in like smaller communities like this because of air quality, let's say of like New York or Nashville? Because like when I visited Nashville, I remember seeing smog out there, but when I'm here in Northwest Arkansas, I don't see smog everywhere and worry about my air quality. I also kind of think it's kind of like it needs to look a lot slicker. Because, and it's not because it's like the tape or anything, but when I think of a fan, I think of those like not just another fan. I think of like those boys' phones, or like those fans, not phones. They have that big oval shape and how it like circulates air like a cyclone kind of thing. It just needs to look slick, but it still needs to have that. It needs to have that modern look, if that makes sense.
I completely agree with you. They look ridiculous.
No, but that's why it's in the prototype thing.
One of the early conversations I ever had, right? So Me being me, right? The first thing I did is like, oh, it's gonna take about $6 million to put one of these in every classroom in Arkansas. I know some folks who have $6 million. Let's go ask them. And one of the things that it made me most nervous about to ask is, if this is successful, right, and it shows up on national news, this is Arkansas's response to COVID, right? But if it works, right? But yes, making it look slick, I think that's many advantages, right? But how do you do that
It'll sell
without?
into homes, like not just classrooms, it'll make people want to buy and put it in their home.
Yep, but how do you do it cost effectively, right? What does the supply chain look like for whatever makes it look slick, right? How do you figure all that out? You don't have any money.
chips in it.
And to your first question about where, they would go, I would say that we've gotten a lot of feedback from the website from people not in Arkansas, but, for example, there's a teacher in California who's recently thanking us for the resources and saying they're going to build like 7 of them. And I think part of that is, you mentioned smog. One of the applications for these is not related to viruses, but, when they have forest fires out there, they have done things like this to clean air. So yeah, I think in general, anywhere you have denser populations or people together in small spaces, which could also happen in rural areas.
What other questions? And how are we doing? Fine. I think it's the last question. Yes.
Okay, so the earlier you guys were talking about how the big companies they did the box for like you were like, why were they doing the box if it's not efficient? Do you think that has anything to do with what we talked about earlier, the supply chain of their costs? Maybe, do you think that's why?
I'm sure that's what it is. I don't know, but for example, the Lasco product that has the slot for the filter in the back, it wouldn't be too hard, I'm sure, for them to make a different mold to have a shrouded front grille, but that would have to be a new thing that they would make. And instead, I think they probably made the choice to just stick with their standard front grille that they have. And the efficiency takes about a 30% hit, but it probably was a cost consideration.
Well, it's interesting. So we talked to Lasco, right? And they shipped that product with a MERV 8 filter, right? Which is good for things like smog, but doesn't work for COVID, right? And the question was, hey, instead of sending us a bunch of these with filters that we're not going to use, right? Can we just put in MERV 13 coming straight from you? And the answer was basically no, right? That would be a whole new product line, it'd be a whole new supply chain, right? And so it's weird, right? Some of those things that seem trivial.
Why?
Yeah, I don't know, right? I mean, just they have their supply chain lined up, and changing that to them is not trivial. But we have supply chain experts around here, so maybe we can help figure it out. So I think now, right, part of the agenda, so we are asking for your help, right? So during this next part of the agenda, I think we're going to be building some of these, right? So you can see how they all come together. We'll have a couple more to distribute, so we appreciate your help. But take the time also to think about all the challenges that you've heard, right? Because afterwards, we're going to come back together and solicit your feedback on, hey, if you were sitting up here with this opportunity, how would you move it forward, right? How would you raise awareness? How would you optimize? How would you make it look more slick, right? And how do we move this thing forward together? So we appreciate your brain cycles, and I'll let you kick us over to the next.
Absolutely. All right. So now we're going to be soliciting some volunteers. So who wants to build some air filters?
What if we just break the room in half? Have